Hello, my name is Alden Jenks. This is going to be an analysis of the final movement of Mozart's String Quartet, Köchel number 387. Your experience will be enhanced, I think, if you are acquainted with the previous movements, and especially if you have seen the analyses of those movements in this series. This is directed principally to people who can read music to one degree or another, but if not, try it anyway. If you've been working through the first three movements of this quartet with us, you will know that we have passed through three quite distinct landscapes. I don't know. Every metaphor fails with music, beginning with fast and slow. In the fourth movement, yet another landscape. Here there comes forth a confrontation, a debate, a dance of two styles, two traditions, one old, one new. One, the contrapuntal sort of music you might associate with Johann Sebastian Bach. The other, the new Italian style, lyrical and operatic. So, some kind of contrast or conflict. And let's see how Mozart turns a struggle into play. You know, it would be fun to work through this movement and see how the last movement of his Symphony number 41 in C deals with the same stylistic issues. Both movements begin with solemn statements of fugue subjects as though we were securely in Bach's temple of counterpoint. In fact, the subject in the symphony is exactly the same as one Bach chose for the E major fugue in the second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. And you know what? Bach stole that. So it's an old tradition. Let's listen to the opening of the fourth movement of this quartet. The opening 16 bars suggest, of course, a fugue. But what did this mean? Not to Mozart, but to his audience. In other words, what was Mozart saying by using this somewhat antiquated form? As I mentioned in the discussion of the Andante movement, classical rhetoric, the art of designing a speech in the 16th and 17th century, was also applied to music. An important concept was the topos, which in rhetoric was, quote, a theme held in common by orators. I wonder whether the current use of meme doesn't refer to the same thing. And in this musical context, it's important to say that the topos was held in common was recognized by the listener. A simple example is the use of a horn call to evoke hunting or perhaps warfare. When Beethoven uses drone on the A string in the Quartet Opus 132, he's calling up an association with the bagpipe. In his Pastoral Symphony, he evokes a thunderstorm. When Mozart invokes the fugue topos, I think he's signifying learned, difficult, intellectual, and perhaps solemn, serious, even religious. As an aside, this is not an isolated example. Mozart wrote fully worked out fugues in several other quartets, as did Haydn and many other composers. It has been said that in the period 1770 to 80, the string quartet was recognized as a testing ground for fugal writing. All right, let's look at this. Another thing, sorry. Let me just point out something so stunningly obvious that we haven't even reflected on it until now. We begin at the beginning. But is that necessary? Why do we do that? There are other ways to try to understand a piece of music. What if we start at the end and work backwards? or start in the middle and refer both to the past and to the future. If we're comparing quartets, it might be quite sensible to compare, say, the techniques used in the development section of K387 to those used in K428. And sure, in this series we do at times jump up a level and take in a larger span that we have already traversed. But in the end, the musical experience is not one within which we can compare past and future, is it? Or work backwards from the end to the beginning. We don't hear a piece of music that way. And of course, that is why we begin at the beginning. We want to work our way through this piece as it unfolds before us, as it reveals itself to us. If Mozart has prepared a surprise, let us be surprised. The first surprise is the opening of the piece, and it may be that Mozart was as surprised as we are. And there are more surprises. After the solemn fugal opening to which we will return, at measure 17 he throws the whole thing aside and breaks into what I always hear as giggling eighth notes, which run down and down, pass from one instrument to the next until, with a final G major cadence, something new begins. So what topos is this? I'm not sure it carries as much weighty significance as the fugue, but it clearly evokes the light textured, galant style that we have discussed in previous movements. The invasion of the Italians, Italian opera buffa in particular, funny opera. So is this confrontation a kind of musical rebellion? Is that the meaning? I mean social, political rebellion? Because I don't for a moment think or want to suggest that Mozart was thumbing his nose at the fugue and that grand tradition. But revolution was in the air, and the view of the aristocracy found in Don Giovanni and Le Nozze di Figaro has been much commented on. Of Mozart's political views, if he had any, we have no direct evidence. He did join the Masonic order in Vienna, which was associated with more liberal, humanistic views. But this sounds more like an intellectual than a political liberalism. Incidentally, there's an approach to Mozart's music taken by Y. Allenbrook, who finds allusions to a variety of dance forms throughout Mozart's music. And these, she says, are ways of making the music intelligible to listeners of the day, as they would most likely recognize those allusions. Another topos. She says what I'm calling this giggly music is a typical contradance riff, which we should think of as being in 2/4, a strong two-beat dance. So, I wanted to comment on that abrupt contrast before scrutinizing the details. This movement has been described as a combination of sonata and fugue, and we can leave it at that, though my sense is that the purposes of Mozart's sonata strategies very much override the conventions of the fugue. And the very notion of combining such disparate styles shines a very bright light on what I've called the cut and paste technique of the classical style. It might remind you of the approach in Stravinsky's symphonies of wind instruments, among many other works, or even the approach seen in the contemporary collages of Picasso and Braque. Let's look at the opening 17 measures. The subject. Fugues have subjects, not themes. Sonatas have themes, not subjects. So what? Thumbjecks. Beginning on the tonic note, G. The red rectangle here in the example points out the second statement of the subject. Notice that it begins on D the same note the first statement ended on, 5 notes above G, and this is very correct. This is how J.S. Bach did it. The blue rectangle shows the musical material that accompanies the subject, conventionally called the countersubject. As we might have expected, Mozart comes up with something strange, or interesting, As he did in the minuet, he's playing a rhythm game. The countersubject begins on the 4th weak beat of the measure, forms a dissonance with the subject on the first strong beat of the next measure, and drops down a step on the 2nd weak beat. This short-breathed syncopated figure scurries around under the ponderous whole notes of the subject, and it very quickly undergoes what one author refers to as Mozart's technique of thematic evolution, a term that illuminates what happens to this countersubject, as you will see. At measure 9, the countersubject gets, stretched in time as well as musical space, and in measure 14 we see another transformation. The first beat has not been sounded by either of the previous versions of this figure. Now it is omitted altogether. While these transformations are taking place in violin 2, the same transformations begin 5 bars later in violin 1. By measure 13, all 3 versions of this countersubject and the last statement of the subject are all heard simultaneously. In this image, CS stands for countersubject, V, 1, 2, and 3 means versions 1, 2, and 3, and S means subject. Okay, let's listen to that much. All of this contrapuntal ingenuity dissolves into those giggly eighth notes. They run up and down the G major scale in the first and then the second violin, and an abbreviated version in the viola takes us to a marvelous passage conventionally called a bridge, in which the galant style below and the fugal above are heard simultaneously. Listen. Now you see that here it is not the subject, but 2 new versions of the countersubject, which are presented fugally. We call these measures a bridge because it is intended to carry us from the home key area of G to the new one in D, but it doesn't quite reach the other side and stops in midair, so to speak, when it arrives not at the ultimate destination, D major, but at the dominant of D major, the A major triad. From here, the midpoint of the bridge, the contrapuntal texture has been abandoned, and the emphasis on the A major triad is fueled by these repeated eighth notes in the viola. In the violins, a figure we've pointed out in the first and second movements, a fragment of the chromatic scale. Should we call this a theme, a motive, or is it just part of the brick and mortar materials of the classical style requiring no further qualification? I would say yes to all those descriptions. Yes, but the chromatic scale was material available to any composer. The degree to which it functions to unify a movement or an entire piece might bring us to call it emotive. It would be a theme if it were placed and functioned as a theme, but so far it's not. But the night is young, as we used to say when we were. All this busy cadencing that seems to be pointing to the definitive arrival of the D triad. In fact, the triad never clearly arrives. Instead, a new fugal exposition begins. And notice how the new subject begins with what seems to be the last note of the bridge. There's an overlap. This way of eliding from one passage to another, and in this case from one style to the other, has already been used in this piece. And the new fugal exposition exposes what? That relentlessly evolving counter-subject. It resembles both versions 4 and 5. Let's call it version 6. This material is performed by every instrument in turn from low to high. At measure 69, a more definite statement of the D major tonality occurs. The writing gets even more dense. The second violin begins another statement of the counter-subject version 5. At the same time, the cello begins a statement of the original subject, now in D major. Okay, now let's just run through the score from the end of the bridge to this point with the materials identified. Here at last, the definitive arrival on D major we were waiting for, speaking in terms of the conventions of the sonata, not the fugue. And what follows is all cheerful opera buffa music, homophonic as opposed to polyphonic. That is, there's a clear melody on top and a simple harmonic support provided by the other instruments. The phrases all fall readily into 2 and 4 bars, and it's a relief after all the earnest fugal chugging that we've seen. Typically, this kind of music is called the closing theme. At the very end of what now is clearly the sonata exposition, there is a short chromatic figure that takes us back to the beginning, as the repeat sign indicates. That short chromatic figure leads as well to the development, and we find the chromatic figure we have seen in the first and second movements now assuming thematic status. What is the chromatic scale? It's the scale of all keys at once or of no key at all. Mozart uses it to drift from harmony to harmony, never quite resolving, never quite arriving, until at measure 142 there is an unexpected halt on a chord that suggests the key of B-flat minor. Listen. The reign of the chromatic is not over. A series of statements of the fugue theme over 16 bars wanders from key to key without lingering in any one for long. The statements begin on notes, each a perfect fifth above the one preceding, thus B flat, F, C, and G. As you heard, the material accompanying these statements is utterly non-contrapuntal, just repeated quarter notes, but repeated notes with a little half-step hook at the end. We haven't really heard this before, though it bears some resemblance to the more extended chromatic passages in measures 39 to 42. When the cello arrives on D at measure 159, together with the other instruments, the harmony definitely suggests D major, dominant of our home key. This may be a signal that the recapitulation is near. Perversely, the cello then retraces the tones beginning each statement of the fugue subject, and from this point all the instruments take part in a chromatic slide downward with music recalling something we were just looking at. But here it arrives at a G7th harmony, followed by 7 beats of silence, then boom, C major, and the giggly contradance that came after the fugue that started the movement. So what kind of recapitulation is this? Let's listen. If this is the recapitulation, it's in the wrong key without the obligatory presentation of the main theme, the solemn fugue subject. What's going on? There's little doubt that listeners at that time, the more musically literate at least, would have been asking themselves the same thing. What's he doing? But I expect you can see the reason. What would be the point? No, point isn't the right word. What would be the drama, the surprise, to start off the recapitulation with the theme we've just heard 4 times? Mozart is playing with the idiom he inherited and demonstrating his mastery by this freedom from convention. Well, in the then current model of sonata form, after the initial key area, the destination and function of the bridge that now follows should be the arrival at a new key area. In the exposition, that new key was D major, a fifth 5 notes above the home key, G major. So here, in the recapitulation, the bridge should take us starting in C major to, yes indeed, 5 notes above C is G major, the original home key. Let's see how that happens. The 8th note contradance continues, as it did in the exposition, for 14.5 measures, and starts the bridge, here still in C major, to the second subject and key area. Here is part of the bridge. Okay, we stopped on a D major harmony on our way to the second subject in G, but as in the exposition, the new key area is announced by an arrival at not the tonic, but the dominant harmony of the new key. The new area, in other words, is not yet in the new key. What happens then is an abbreviated version of measures 69 to 85 in the exposition. You heard the cello sneaking in the first theme under the second, didn't you? That happened in the exposition too. What did not happen before was this material. Which dramatizes the arrival at G by moving abruptly away from it. See the cello at measure 221 providing a deceptive cadence, where we're all set up to expect an arrival on the G harmony. The cello gives us an E flat instead and moves by chromatic steps through a whole series of harmonies until finally gives us the arrival at G at measure 233. What follows is exactly what we heard in the exposition, what we called the closing theme. It takes us again to the rising chromatic scale figure that led to the development section. Mozart even indicates the possibility of a repeat at measure 267. And for 2 bars we could easily suppose we were hearing the development starting all over again. Instead it's the coda, a brief final summarizing statement. A cascading series of entrances of this chromatic figure is heard again, creating a series of modulations that amount to a slow and powerful cadential progression leading to measure 282. There the fugue subject occurs 4 times in immediate succession. This display of technical bravura is called the stretto, meaning not stressed, but tight or close, something like that. And as at the opening, the fuguing is followed by some quick eighth notes and a cadence that, once again, is not the final cadence. That is carried out by one more statement of the fugue subject, followed by a suave, debonair trill in the 3 upper voices, dominant to final tonic. Well, that's the last movement. Thinking about this quartet, one of Mozart's attributes that brings us back to his music is its lack of aggression, its willingness to charm, even seduce. But standing back a pace or 2 from all of that in this movement, we're struck by the really fabulous complexity, both technical and aesthetic, that's not really typical. Standing back a few paces more, bringing the whole quartet into view, we can see that something quite extraordinary has taken place. So, I very much hope that you have enjoyed this journey through the string quartet K387 as much as I have. If you are a student of music and would like to delve deep into some other compositions, I invite you to study other music with me, in person or via Zoom. Just go to the contact page on my website and let me know where your interests lie.